Good afternoon, everyone. It's never fun to interrupt good conversation over a meal, but we're going to go ahead and get our program started, and I want to thank you all for being here. I'm Matthew Martin with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and we're about to start our plenary session on the new geography of poverty and the opportunity for regional strategies. Let me just very quickly add my thanks to all of you for attending, for our speakers, for coming, to our partners, especially the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, for being willing to move this down to the 5th Federal Reserve District. I've seen Teresa Singleton around. She's upright and doesn't look too stressed out, so I think this has gone well. I think the experiment has worked out, and we're very grateful to be a part of that. In a few minutes, we're going to have a panel discussion, but before that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for our session today. Tom Barkin became President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in January of this year. In that role, he is responsible for the Richmond Fed's monetary policy, payment services, and bank supervision and regulation. He serves on the Federal Reserve's chief monetary policy body, the Federal Open Market Committee, and in 2018, he is a voting member. So that means he showed up on day one and had to get ready for that first FOMC meeting as a voting member. What might be less well known about the Richmond Fed is that we also have responsibility for the information technology organization for the entire Federal Reserve System. So that's another aspect of Tom's portfolio. Prior to joining the Richmond Fed, Tom spent 30 years working at the worldwide management consulting firm McKinsey & Company. He was a senior partner overseeing McKinsey's offices in the southern United States and providing strategic counsel to a diverse portfolio of clients. And he also served as the company's chief financial officer and chief risk officer. But Tom is not new to the Federal Reserve System. He was a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta from 2009 to 2014, and he served as the board chair from 2013 to 2014. His other board service includes a member of the Emory University Board of Trustees and a board member of the Greater Washington Partnership. He is a native of Tampa, Florida, and attended Harvard University, where he earned his undergraduate, law, and Master's of Business Administration degrees. So please join me in welcoming President Barkin.
Thanks for having me here today. I want to encourage you to keep on eating while I'm talking. I think if you like what I'm saying, just hit the forks 2 or 3 times loudly so I'll know you like it. If you don't, I'll just get quiet silence. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people here. I think we're well over 500 or even 600 people at this conference. I want to join my thanks to the organizers for putting this together and for each of you for contributing and collaborating in this so well. I also want to thank the Baltimore Board of Directors, who's here in force, and the Community Investment Council, who've taken the time to join us. And one of our directors, Marianne Scully, is actually speaking later today on women and wealth building, and I look forward to hearing from her then. This conference addresses a set of issues that have been of interest to me for a long time and have taken on a particular urgency since I joined the Fed. You may or may not have heard of the economist Robert Lucas, who won the '95 Nobel Prize. He wrote several decades ago in an article about economic development, he wrote the following: "The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like this are simply staggering. And once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else." And he was right. I've spent the past 9 months traveling through our district, the 5th District, and I've been struck by the tremendous diversity in our communities and by the diversity in the challenges they face. The more I learn about our district, the more I want to understand why some areas are thriving while others are struggling, and what can be done to help everyone. I'm here to introduce our upcoming panel, which has a lot of experts on that topic, and I thought I might set up that conversation in the context of the macroeconomy. Before I say more, the views I'm going to express are my own and might not be shared by Pat Harker, who's sitting at the table up front, or any of my other colleagues in the Federal Reserve System or on the Federal Open Market Committee. The FOMC met last week, and we reviewed what looks to us like a pretty healthy economy. GDP growth is strong, inflation is moderate, and the unemployment rate is as low as it's been since the late 60s. We've been adding an average of almost 200,000 jobs a month for the last 5 years. That's a very large number when you think that the break-even number to keep up with population growth is about 80 to 100,000 jobs a month. There are actually today more job vacancies than there are people looking for jobs. One question many people have is, how long can this kind of growth last? Well, you can boil growth down to a pretty simple formula. Growth depends on how many people are working and how productive they are. Right now, productivity growth in our economy is fairly slow. So absent a productivity surge, more growth requires more people in the labor force. But our population is also growing slowly, which means that growth in the labor force needs to come from people who are currently on the sidelines. And there are a lot of people on the sidelines, even today. The labor force participation rate has dropped about 4.5 percentage points since 2000, from a little over 67% to a little under 63%. That may or may not sound like a lot to you, but it really is a big number to people who study this kind of thing. So while the unemployment rate has dropped about 6 percentage points since its peak, the employment to population ratio is still below pre-recession levels. Well, how likely are people who've left the labor force to return? Much of the drop in participation is the result of demographics, baby boomers retiring, more young people attending college. But if we look at the participation rate for prime age workers, that's 25 to 54, it's much higher, around 82%, only 2 percentage points below its peak in 2000. That suggests many of the people on the sidelines intend to remain there. So what can we do? We're unlikely to get retirees back into the workforce. We want our kids to finish school. But there are large disparities between groups of people of prime working age across a variety of dimensions, including education, race, gender, and geography. Growing the labor force requires changing the labor market outcomes for these groups. Now, given the themes of this conference, I'll focus today on geographic differences. One thing that struck me in my time in this job is the stark difference between the opportunities available to people in urban areas and rural areas. It's remarkable how quickly and how much things change as you leave the city. I see it as I travel through the 5th District, and I see it in the data. Across the district as a whole, the employment to population ratio for 16 to 64-year-old folks is about 6 percentage points higher in urban areas than in rural areas. Interestingly, Maryland is an exception to that. It's the only state in the district where these measures are about the same. That probably reflects the state's size, which puts rural areas in close contact with urban areas. There are a number of factors to untangle about why this divide exists, but in many cases it's because the jobs have moved and the people, often understandably, haven't. While broadly speaking, labor market outcomes are better in urban areas than rural areas, that's not true for every part of an urban area. There are divides within cities as well. In this, unfortunately, Maryland is not an exception. In Baltimore, at the same time that new shops and restaurants are being built on Pratt Street and luxury apartment towers are rising on Light Street, there are parts of the city where people can't find jobs and row houses sit vacant. This is a topic our bank has been actively studying for several years. For example, we are currently in the midst of an extensive research project focused on Baltimore to understand how some individuals are able to move out of intergenerational poverty. I wish I could tell you we'd found a silver bullet, but as you know, the challenges here are complex. We have to keep searching for the answers, though, because the size of the opportunity is significant. In addition to growth, areas with higher employment rates tend to have lower poverty rates, lower crime rates, and fewer challenges with substance abuse. And while there's no one-size-fits-all answer, I do think there are some common themes, in particular workforce development and mobility. And as our panel said yesterday afternoon, think people in addition to place. I mentioned there are currently more open jobs than there are people looking for jobs. And I've lost count of how many now hiring signs I've seen outside retail stores and on highway billboards. So why aren't people in inner cities and rural areas filling these jobs? Part of the answer may well be a mismatch between the skills employers are seeking and the ones people have. One qualification many employers are looking for is a 4-year college degree, but students from rural areas are less likely to attend college. Economists at the University of Virginia, for example, found that college attendance ranges from less than 50% of high school graduates in some low-income, predominantly rural school districts to more than 80% in some high-income suburban school districts. Students who grow up in the inner city also are less likely to attend college than their suburban peers, perhaps because they're significantly less likely to graduate from high school in the first place. Getting kids to enroll in college is just part of the challenge. Roughly 40% of college attendees fail to earn a degree within 6 years. That's a number that shocked me. These students may be left with significant debt and few benefits. So we also need to look at how we prepare students to succeed in college. And that preparation becomes very early in life before a child even enters kindergarten. Of course, there are well-paying jobs that don't require a 4-year college degree, and there are students for whom a 4-year college is not the right fit. Preparation at the K-12 level needs to include informing students about these opportunities and about how they can train for them, for example, at community colleges or via apprenticeship programs. All that said, it doesn't do much good to train people for jobs that don't exist, and so we need to look at the demand side as well. It can be challenging to lure employers to some rural and inner city areas, but workforce development can help by creating the skilled workers that potential employers tell me they're looking for. Doing so helps ensure that zip code isn't destiny. Mobility is another need in both rural and inner city areas. Even if there are jobs, it can be difficult for people to get to them. Rural areas lack public transportation, and in cities you might have to transfer buses 3 times. This is a topic that, of course, is outside the purview of a central bank, but our community development team has convened several symposiums on this topic because of its importance. So the challenges are huge, but so are the opportunities. If we want our economy to continue to grow, we need to find ways to address the obstacles rural and inner city people face in joining the labor force. By doing so, we can address the poverty and associated ills that afflict far too many of our neighbors. The Richmond Bank is digging deeply into these issues and is passionate about them, and welcomes any thoughts you have on potential solutions. And now, to take the question forward, I look forward to hearing the thoughts of our panel.
All right, while our panel settles in, I'll kick us off here. You know, it's always interesting when you have a setup like this with a meal. The panel gets to sit down and converse before, so I feel like we sort of had the panel over lunch already. It's a shame the rest of you weren't able to hear it, but we'll try and carry that conversation on up here. So the title of our session here is The New Geography of Poverty and Opportunities for Regional Strategies. And I'd noted a number of recent studies of American poverty have focused on the rise in metropolitan suburbs. So for example, a 2015 census data report by Brookings described how 16 million people now live in poverty in suburban neighborhoods. And while we certainly shouldn't ignore that trend, we can't let it distract us from the significant concentration of impoverished people who live in rural and urban areas. In that same year, 2015, an average of 19.6% of urban residents and 17.2% of rural residents lived in poverty, and many of those are concentrated in specific census tracts and burdened by decades of intergenerational poverty. So how different are the economies of rural and urban communities? Or to maybe state that differently, are there similarities between them? And especially for those that have been seen severe disinvestment over the past few decades. If you think about it, most every low-income community, it seems, struggles to encourage new business or grow existing ones for many of the same reasons: lack of financial capital, lack of supports for local entrepreneurs, lack of supportive infrastructure, or lack of skilled workers. So poor rural and urban communities both face those issues and some other ones, such as affordable housing shortages, and even in metro areas, as Tom alluded to, an essential lack of affordable public transportation. But there's also great potential in these communities, and our distinguished panel here is going to talk about how they are working to unlock these opportunities. Each one of them will talk about locally grown economic development and mobility strategies. We will also explore what can happen when residents come together and dream up solutions to the challenges their communities face. And as part of these solutions, they yield not only economic growth, but advance equity and inclusion goals and hopefully lead to higher quality of life as well. And then finally, we hope to discuss larger systems and policies that our panelists think need changing to bring about greater opportunity for people living in poverty. So let me briefly introduce the panel that we have here. And I'll start on the far left end. We have Stephanie Tyree, who's Executive Director of the West Virginia Community Development Hub. Seated next to her is Jerry Roll, Executive Director of Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky. And then next we have Michael McAfee, who is the President and CEO of PolicyLink. And to my immediate right, we have Ryan Haygood, who's the President of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. A key theme of this plenary is finding common ground between urban and rural communities. And in that spirit, I'd like to have each of you talk briefly, set the stage by talking about the communities in which you work. That is, give us just a couple of sentences about the challenges your community faces, the assets that you see available there, and Michael, in your case, talk about any place you're doing work or some general themes you might see in the work that your organization is doing. We'll start at the far end with Stephanie.
Great. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm happy to be here. So I work in West Virginia. The West Virginia Community Development Hub is a statewide organization. So we work with communities all over the state. We really focus on small rural communities, usually 15,000 people or less in the communities. Some communities that we work with have 500 people or less. Now, when I talk about 15,000 people or less in West Virginia communities, that's most of our communities. Our largest town is Charleston, our capital city, which has less than 50,000 people, right? So we're a rural state. And we have all of the challenges that have already been mentioned up here: workforce participation, access to transportation, access to high-paying, well-paying jobs, trained, educated workforce. I mean, the list of challenges, when you just list them out, can seem overwhelming. But the hub is focused on asset-based community development. So we start from thinking about what are the benefits and the assets that the communities that we work with have. And each community that we work with can list dozens of assets that they have in their own community. These are often communities where the main street is full of beautiful old historic buildings that are almost completely empty, right? Where business has disinvested, industry has disinvested, but there are people that are there who still care about their communities and are trying to reinvent it. I think I'll talk more about that later, but sure. That's what our communities look like.
I'm Jerry Roll. I'm the director of the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky. Like Stephanie, I'm happy to be here. Also, like Stephanie, I'm in Appalachia, so we're quite similar to West Virginia. But a lot of folks feel like, or think, when they think about Appalachia, they think about J.D. Vance. He didn't grow up in Appalachia. We can talk about that later if you want to. But Appalachia goes all the way from Maine down to Alabama. And if you look at that entire range that was identified as during the War on Poverty, and that we labeled all of our counties as, some of them as distressed, and we looked at all of that. So if you look at the map today, there's about 80 counties in that whole stretch that are still distressed. If you look at the color-coded map, there's a big red dot right in the middle of the range, and that would be West Virginia, Kentucky, Western North Carolina, and Southeast Ohio. There's 5 states that converge. Of those around 80 counties, more than 50 of them are in Eastern Kentucky. That's where I live, right there smack in the middle of that red dot. The Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky is a community foundation, and we started about 10 years ago with the thought that we needed to build our capacity in our community in order to use the assets that were financial that might be available to us. And the statistic I like to throw out there, as a woman in Perry County, Kentucky, which happens to be where I live in a little town called Busy, right on the North Fork of the Kentucky River between Butterfly and Typo. In my community, I have the shortest life expectancy of any woman in this room. Any woman in the United States, I have the shortest life expectancy as a woman living in Perry County, Kentucky. So we have some challenges, but also like West Virginia and Stephanie's communities, we have far more assets and we're beginning to recognize those. So we're a community foundation. We're headquartered in and of the coal fields of southeastern Kentucky. And I'm gonna pass the mic and we'll keep talking, I hope.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So PolicyLink works all over the country, but two places that are rural that we work in, I would say, would be in Berea, Kentucky and Indianola, Mississippi. And the one thing I find about all of these places, especially having grown up fishing and hunting with my dad in rural places all around the country, is that people actually share the same hopes and aspirations. And that while the context may be different, the problems are quite similar. You know, people want access to good jobs. People want good education. People want to believe that their children will do better than they will do. And they want to work. And in many cases, they are working. Whether they have a job that we would describe it or not, they're working. They're doing something to make a living. And in fact, they're far more industrious even when they're doing it legally than we would ever imagine. And so for me, what I'm fascinated by is often how we try to set up this dichotomy between rural and urban that, quite frankly, I don't see when I'm in community. I see folks in America trying to have a better opportunity. And when I enter, especially if I'm entering a place where it is predominantly white, I join with the same sensitivities that I do when I'm in an urban community. I join not being afraid of them. I join not seeing them as deficient. I join seeing them as my brothers and sisters that deserve me working as hard for them as I would everybody else. I join them thinking that public policy, effectively implemented, is still the right path forward to uplift their lives. And so when I travel across the country, when I think about the population that we hold at PolicyLink as our population of interest, the 100 million in America living at 200% of poverty, I'm excited because, well, I don't see that population as fundamentally different in terms of their hopes and aspirations. And what I hope we can do as a nation is get to a place where we see value in every community, not just in our gleaming downtowns that are coming back, but in every community. And so for me, I see opportunity when I go to these places. I don't see despair. I come out of these communities. I know their creativity. I know their hard work. But what I see there is also gives me hope for this nation, even in this tough time. That in spite of everybody trying to, all the forces that are trying to divide us, that if we actually stay focused on centering what matters to folks, is my community safe? Will my child have good health care? Will my family have good health care? Will I have a good job with benefits? We can get through this. So that's what keeps me anchored. While I don't, every place has a different context. We all want the same thing. And my job as a leader of an institution that has some agency to help bring about that change, it is to not play into the divisiveness. It is not to play into trying to act like rural communities are so exotic that I can't understand them, or vice versa about urban communities. It is just to stay focused on centering the work and listening to the fundamental thing that people want us to do, which is to create communities of opportunity no matter what zip code you reside in.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Haygood, as was mentioned. I think I got two opportunities for you to hear me, both through the mic and through my lapel, so I think I'm in good shape here. As was mentioned, I lead the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We are a legal advocacy organization And our mission really is to identify and to topple structural racial walls of exclusion that, if knocked down, will open up opportunities for people of color in urban centers across New Jersey. And I was listening to the conversation, which I'm really thankful to be a part of, and I was really struck by the fact that this is the 50th anniversary of a lot of things. One, it's the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. But before he was assassinated, he visited, among other states, New Jersey, and he began to lay the groundwork for the Poor People's Campaign. He visited Newark 50 years ago this year, and 8 days later went to Memphis, and there he was assassinated. This is also the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and folks know that that was intended by President Johnson to be the most important piece of civil rights legislation that would robustly increase home ownership among Black and Latino and other families of color. And an interesting thing has happened in the last 50 years. You all know that in the last 50 years, home ownership among Black and Latino families has actually fallen. We've also seen the tripling of the racial wealth gap in the last 50 years after Dr. King laid the groundwork for the Poor People's Campaign. And New Jersey is really no exception, having experienced that increase in the racial wealth gap. So New Jersey is interesting. It's one of the most, it's one of the wealthiest states in America. The median net worth for New Jersey's white families is $271,000 a year, the highest in America, $271,000 a year. The median net worth for New Jersey's white families, the highest in America. But by stark contrast, the median net worth for New Jersey's Latino families is $7,200. And the median net worth for New Jersey's Black families is $5,900. 50 years after Dr. King laid the groundwork for the Poor People's Campaign. And the truth of the matter is that these disparities reflect systems that have been created to advance racial inequality. To Michael's point, these aren't the result of individual failures as much as they reflect systems that have advanced racial inequality. I do a lot of work in the city of Newark, which is where I both live and where our organization is housed. Newark is an interesting city. It is a city that really is exploding with development, particularly in the downtown area. There are billions and billions of construction projects, either completed, underway, or in the pipeline. On my way to work each morning, I make a left on Broad Street. Broad is kind of the main artery through the downtown of Newark, New Jersey. Newark is a city of about 300,000 people. It's the largest city in New Jersey. It's about, bless you, 55% Black. That's a good home training. I'm sorry, y'all. Thanks, Mom. I appreciate that. But it's about 55% Black. It's about 80% people of color overall. And when I make this left on Broad Street, the first thing I pass is this thing called the One Stop. The One Stop is the city agency that's designed to help connect people to employment opportunities, skills training if they need it, interview skills, resume building, a number of things designed to help local residents get connected to work. And it's interesting because the line out the door is often about a block long, and they say they're facing to the left, right? So I make a left on Broad. Folks waiting in line are facing left. But behind them, about 8 blocks down Broad Street, is an explosion in development. So we just opened in the last year the first Starbucks in the city of Newark. Next to the Starbucks is now, can folks guess it? The Whole Foods. One of the telltale signs of incredible development in cities. But what strikes me often on my commute to work is the way in which local residents literally have their back turned toward the opportunity that is behind them just 8 blocks down the same street. And so I'll say quickly, one of the things that we did at the Institute was really sort of undertook an intensive look at sort of who works in the city of Newark, what they make, what industries, and we found a really staggering statistic that found that in the city of Newark, local residents hold just 18%, 18% of all jobs in the city, which put differently means that 82% of those who work in the city of Newark don't live in the city of Newark. And in this way, Newark is really an outlier. By comparison, here in Baltimore, it's 33% of local residents who work in the city. In New Orleans, it's 45%. But in the city of Newark, it's just 18%. And here's a couple of things that we learned as part of our study. One, this does not reflect that local residents don't want to work or they're unqualified to work. In fact, the labor force participation rate of local residents in the city of Newark is higher than both the state average and the national average. We found that the majority of those who do work, 58% of those who do work, commute up to an hour each way. We thought, well, maybe the number 18% is so low because there's not a high incidence of college attainment. We found that in the city of Newark, about 1/3 of all jobs require a college degree, which is also consistent with the national average. And folks said, well, the reason that the number is so low of local residents who work in the city of Newark is because they have high incidence of criminal entanglement. So we looked at that. We found that actually local residents have about the same rate of criminal entanglement as the national average. About 1/4 of local residents have some level of criminal entanglement. So it's not because folks don't want to work. It's not because they don't get to work, can't get to work. It's not because they're without a college degree or because they have high incidence of criminal entanglement. In fact, what we've ultimately found is that that low rate of local residents is a function of race and the way that race constrains opportunities for local residents, the way that it informs how local employers hire or don't hire culturally. There's this sort of built-in resistance to hiring local residents because there's a belief, I'm generalizing here grossly, but there's a belief on the part of many employers that local residents are either unwilling or not ready to work. And so part of what I'll talk more about when it comes back to me is how we partnered with companies, the city, institutions of higher learning, hospitals to create a table at which we created a system that is intentional about connecting local residents to work, really countering the cultural challenges that we faced, the systemic barriers of the city that local residents face in the city, and really thinking about how to robustly connect local residents to the opportunities in their city. There are more jobs in the city of Newark than there are people to occupy those jobs. Our job was really think about how to create a system that will connect local residents to the prosperity in their city.
That's a good launching point for the next discussion point I want to move on to. As you've alluded to, sometimes these challenges cross either city or county or sometimes even in Appalachia state lines. But the resources that you might bring to bear might be more geographically focused or maybe even broader than that. How do you, in the context of thinking about the region and working across these lines, how do you get people and government systems mobilized to work on solutions that cross these lines? What does that look like?
Well, I can start because that was really the premise of the question we asked when we started our community foundation, because I was in a meeting not unlike this, and someone with one of the big foundations like Robert Wood Johnson or somebody said, you know, in philanthropy we have a lot of power because we have the money, which was the, you know, ding, ding, ding. Okay, so if the money equals power, what if we give the money to the community? Then the community will have the power. You know, go home and say, hey guys, let's start a community foundation. We'll have the money and then we'll have the power. But I think that translates to all the different kinds of wealth, whether it's social capital, money, if it's civic capital. All of those things have to be in the community in order for those things to translate into the power for change around policy or whatever it may be. So I guess where I'm going with that is until people understand and believe, and in order to believe it, I think you have to feel it and be a part of it, that they do indeed have some power to affect change, that change isn't going to happen. And that can't come from just the government or just philanthropy or just, it's that whole, in the session prior to lunch, that ecosystem. I think we've spent so much time trying to figure out what is access to capital. How do we get more money here? I think it's that whole ecosystem. And the money isn't going to work if we don't have the capacity and the resources to use that money effectively. And the best way to use that effectively in a community is by giving that power to the people in that community, not the people from outside the community who want to tell you what the best thing to do is. I think a lot of Stephanie's work is around engaging communities and looking at their own assets, and then having people in the community hold that government accountable.
Does that resonate with other panelists?
Yeah, I can go next. That is right. That is what we do at the Hub. Is we're all about community engagement, and what we believe is that for any place, but especially for places where they're struggling with the most economic challenges, most social challenges, and most individual personal challenges, long-term equitable development and revitalization has to come from the bottom up. You know, it cannot come in and be placed on a community. It's not going to last and it's not going to work. And so part of our job at the Hub is to get people to go out and actually go to these other communities and to talk to each other within the community, have communities talk across community lines to each other. I think that we get told a narrative, and we tell ourselves this narrative so much of our place is this particular place, and our challenge is this particular challenge, and they're succeeding over there, and yes, they had challenges, but that's a special place, and they have special things that we don't have. And part of what we try to do is just break down those barriers, because when you get person to person, and you get a community leader talking to another community leader from the place that's been successful, and that community leader says, well, yeah, but 10 years ago, this whole place was bombed out, and nobody cared about this community, and they didn't think that we had any potential, but we started showing up, we started doing the work together, and we forced partners to come in and to see the potential that we saw. We built those collaborations, and now we've been successful. So when you get those person-to-person stories, I think that change can really start to happen. But I do think in terms of that collaboration and that partnership building, the challenge is honestly getting people sort of out of rooms like this and getting them into the communities that we work in and getting on the road. I ran into an old friend from college here just a few minutes ago, and hi Henry, and he was asking me what I do, and I was trying to explain what the Community Development Hub does, which is a lot of different things. And he's like, oh, so basically you just drive around the state and help people and help them try to fix their communities and improve things. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty much it. There's a lot of miles that we put on our car, a lot of late nights in communities, and a lot of, honestly, like staying at houses with community leaders who host you and just meeting people where they are to do the hard work. One of the challenges that I think that we have when we get into spaces where we're talking to each other as organizations or as agencies or as entities, particularly in low wealth places, is this sense that it's a zero-sum game, and that for me to succeed, I need to get that money that you have or that you've somehow accessed. And so when the Hub was formed, one of our first tenets of what we were trying to address was what we called turf suppression, right? So this idea that people are so focused on protecting their own turf and building their turf that actually you're limiting the productiveness of your work and the effectiveness of your work. It's the hardest thing that we do because it's almost a sort of innate approach that many of us have to our work is we want to build out our turf. But what we found is that there is an increasing understanding about the need to go across our turf lines, to build those collaborations, to build unique partnerships, particularly at regional levels with unlikely allies. And that suddenly starts to blow up the pool of what was possible, right? You start finding new resources and new ideas.
Pie gets bigger.
Yes, exactly. And it's been really exciting to see that happen in Appalachia at a regional level too. That's how Jerry and I know each other, is because there's so many people working across the region and seeing that especially the geographic lines where we sometimes split ourselves up are so completely artificial. Now, I do think that in Appalachia, we have a lot of work to do to understand the connections between our places and urban places. And I think there still is a lot of feeling like those lines exist and it's hard to see the similarities, which is part of why I'm so excited to be here today, because I do think there's a lot more alike in our places than unalike.
Yeah. You know, I've seen regional collaboration work in a couple of instances when I was in Kansas City. One with getting a bi-state tax for arts and culture. It helped create a beautiful downtown facility and around the sports, Kansas City Chiefs, Kansas City Royals Stadium. And what I'm fascinated by is how the narrative around opportunity worked so well there. But yet, when it comes to talking about folks who don't have a particular level of means, it gets racialized very quickly. And I watch folks of goodwill stand on the sidelines and let the narrative get co-opted by race. So even when I'm in Chicago and I know folks downstate are suffering, they actually, because of that narrative being so deeply rooted and effective, those folks actually don't see themselves as a part of Chicago. We could be talking about school finance or anything else. It doesn't matter because we've racialized what it means to create opportunity for some. I'm sharing that to say, if we can do it around stadiums and art facilities, we can do it in this capacity. But some of us are going to have to start whispering into folks' ear. And if not whispering, demanding that they stop with this racialized way of framing a narrative. Because the reality is, it is intentional. And it is the thing that is keeping us divided right now. I'm fascinated when I go to places, certain communities, and I'm like, you know, Trump's tax breaks are helping me. But you still see me somehow as your enemy. You still see me as your enemy. And I keep wondering, when will our institutions say that this is no longer going to be tolerated? Because in the rooms that I'm privileged to be in now, I see people willing to just say, I know that's not right, but won't pick up the phone and say, we're not going to do it that way. And I say that to say that all the phrases in this conference are absolutely right. The messages are right. But they actually don't mean nothing if we won't straighten up our back and stop tolerating what we're tolerating. Folks, you know, there are some who have a result statement to free democracy, capitalism from democracy. That is a quite profound narrative that some are advancing. To free capitalism from democracy. And there's a very deep intellectual underpinning to that point of view. And yet, over here, when we talk about the most vulnerable, I still go to too many communities where they tell me don't even mention the word vulnerability. Don't even mention the word poor. Don't even mention those people. I don't know how you can do this work, folks, if you can't own your people. The folks who are trying to free capitalism from democracy own their people. And I'm sharing that to say no strategy will work if those of us as institutional leaders will continue to stand down and allow very toxic behaviors to stand in our society. You're seeing it play out on so many issues right now. And so we can overcome this, but it will require some of us to stand in that storm for a moment and to be willing to suffer the consequence. If you think you're going to create communities of opportunities by wishing and a hoping and coming to a conference, it ain't happening that way. And so what I'm sharing with you is the paradox of what I've seen in the privileged places that I've been able to travel. I see how hard folks will fight for a stadium. I see how hard they will fight for a performing arts center. I see how hard they will fight to renovate that downtown. And I also see how hard they will fight to keep people from being able to come back to the very places where they use public dollars that they should be able to move into. I see how quickly they will racialize an opportunity. I see how quickly we will holler broke when it comes to helping the most vulnerable in the nation. And so I say, I'm just simply suggesting that we are at an exciting, while stressful point in this nation, where we can actually move it forward if we will just stop tolerating the very thing that has been our Achilles heel. This notion that we will allow those who are really brilliant at framing narratives that are toxic to continue that behavior. Because what is happening in places where I live now, like San Francisco, that level of toxicity has become too toxic even for the middle class. I've never been in the most progressive city, the most progressive state in the country, and see such an elegant design to move out all the middle class. It doesn't even have a middle class. How can that be? Folks, we're creating a world that doesn't work for us. The only question is, when will you discover that it doesn't work for you?
So, to follow up on that, this is a pragmatic audience and they are interested in things that work on the ground. So maybe I'll start with you, Ryan. You sort of started to talk about your program. As you've developed strategies, what do you see that works in your community?
So I think the first thing we did in Newark, to I think Stephanie's point, was looked at the opportunities in the city of Newark. You know, Newark is it's got one of the largest seaports. It's got one of the largest airports. It's close to the trains. It's very close to New York City. And the average person who works in the city of Newark earns more than $40,000 a year, even as 1/3 of all black residents live below the federal poverty line. And though Newark is a city that's made up of about 80% people of color, the majority of those who work in the city of Newark are white. So we began convening a table of folks in communities, both connected to work and disconnected to work, community-based organizations who are really trusted in the city of Newark, the city itself under the leadership of Mayor Raz Baraka. We've got a great chancellor of Rutgers University, Nancy Cantor. We've got a great hospital network and some corporations that have been in the city for a long time. And if you look at their mission statements on their website, they talk a lot about building inclusive economies, right? Nobody, no company is on its website as part of its value statement saying, we're setting out, to Michael's point, to create an exclusive economy that excludes local residents and most people of color except in the service industry. Like, you don't find that. So we thought a lot about how do you speak to the shared values of everyone around the table. And what it led us to do, to Matt's question, very early on is to tackle the way we approach conversations around race, this idea of the narrative. And if you as I have, if you interview folks in the city of Newark as they're walking down Broad Street again, you'll find a lot of local residents have been trained. They've been through some workforce training program and maybe even graduated from one or two or more, maybe even earned a certification. There may have been several certifications earned, but that workforce training was not connected to an employment opportunity. And even the way we approach conversations about employment here I'm talking about our cities, is very focused, it's sort of a deficiency model. So it assumes that people are unemployed because they're unqualified to work or disinterested in working, right? There's this sort of laziness about them that has led them to the unemployment and to the 18% number in the city of Newark. And the reality is, as in most places, there's a spectrum of employability. There are folks who, if connected to an opportunity, could work right now. There are others who may need a little bit of training and could work next week, and there's some for whom intensive workforce training would be required. But the truth is that when we talk about employment, in particularly of communities of color, we don't get that benefit of a spectrum of employability. So the first thing we had to tackle was the way we have conversations around work and the way that they're colored, no pun intended, by race. You can't be in a majority people of color city and have the majority of the people working there be white and not have race play a central role in that outcome. There just isn't enough individual responsibility / blame to spread around to make that narrative, to make those numbers, to make that data makes sense independent of race. And so it was a challenge, frankly, for some of our employer partners at these tables. But ultimately, our interests converged. There was a really powerful panel before this one around the business case for local hiring. And you can't refute the point that it is true that businesses do very well when they can pull from the local talent in cities that are close to where the employers are housed. So we began to have conversations around who is doing workforce well. We looked at Baltimore. We did a convening in Newark. We had Baltimore come. We had New Orleans come. San Francisco joined us. San Francisco is a little bit different than Newark, candidly, but they had some interesting insight. No disrespect to San Francisco. And a number of cities. And we did a one-day convening where we looked at the very best practices in workforce development and in connecting local residents to work specifically. And the thing we learned in the city of Newark is that we really sort of do it backwards. We've done it backwards for a lot of years there. We begin with the person, right? So the unemployed person. We assume that person needs some intensive workforce training, so we try to find some place for that person to get the training. They then, if they graduate from that, they graduated to get some degree, and then they start looking for work. But what we learned from other cities, this is not revelation knowledge to folks, but it was new to us in the city of Newark, is the better way to proceed is to begin with the employment opportunity. So you engage the employers first to understand what employment opportunities they have now, what the projections are over the next 5 to 10 years, what the emerging industries are, and then you build out a framework that starts with the employment opportunity. It then looks at workforce training opportunities, those specific skills for those available jobs, and then you sort of reverse engineer to get to folks who are looking for work, who are hungry for work, who, if they need it, can get trained to specific skills for available jobs. So we partner with employers who are willing to commit some concrete number of jobs to this initiative, right? Numerical goals are important. We think about them all the time, particularly when we're thinking about profits and losses and margins, right? We think about data all the time. But when we think about numbers to connect local residents to work, people don't really want to do numbers. We wanted to do numbers. And so we came up with an initiative called Newark 2020. And it's an ambitious goal to connect 2,000 unemployed Newark residents to full-time jobs that pay a living wage by 2020, and it really proceeds with employer partners buying into this idea that we need to create a system, a durable system, that would powerfully connect local residents to the prosperity in their local economy. And we spent the last year really building this infrastructure. One of the features is there are, to be candid, some challenges with the city's workforce agency, this one stop I mentioned at the top of our conversation. So we began engaging really trusted community-based organizations who do workforce training well, who have a track record of really providing powerful resources to local residents who want to work in a particular industry. We have 5 of these, we're calling them hubs in the city of Newark, where local residents can get connected to the hubs. They interact directly with employers, understand what the employment opportunities are by industry, and the training is tailored to that industry. And the local resident is empowered with a menu of employment opportunities by employers who are actually inclined to give, it's not a guarantee of a job, but to give local residents a real shot at finding a work. And then finally, we engage the Heldred Center at Rutgers to be our evaluator, to look at each step of the Newark 2020 initiative, to give us a sense of how we're doing in each way and to keep us on track. Not just toward a numerical goal, though that matters, but really toward ensuring that we're building a system that works for local residents and employer partners and the community-based organizations that are part of this effort.
I think what strikes me is, what I'm hearing is Stephanie talking about what we really need are on the ground, what works, is to have that infrastructure, and I don't mean water and sewer, but infrastructure of tools and resources that actually shows up in communities or neighborhoods and says, here's some tools and resources. Because we have the skills, you have the ability, you can do this work, but you need some tools and resources to do it. So we need that infrastructure to show up, that ecosystem, to build that ecosystem. And government's not inclined to do that right now. But I also hear what Michael's saying is people need to understand that we have way more in common than we don't. And people need to believe they matter in order to engage in a democracy that will be responsive to them. I mean, if you look at, I know we're not supposed to talk about politics, but if you look at the map, you know, President Trump didn't win the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton didn't win the Electoral College. I didn't vote because nobody gives a damn about me won the Electoral College. So when we begin to work in neighborhoods and in communities and bring those tools and resources and put that power back on the ground, which is what it takes, these types of institutions to do that, then people believe that they matter, and then the system will begin to work for all of us. So I guess I was saying earlier at the table, I stay angry a lot lately. I think it's because I'm turning 60 in a couple of weeks. Actually, this week. I'm turning 60 this week, and I'm still talking about the same stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it takes more than a 2-year grant to change the world. We need to invest in infrastructure, meaning people and ecosystems, that all the capital in the world isn't going to matter to downtown New Jersey black folks or rural white people if we don't have the capacity and the tools and resources to use that capital effectively. So, like Michael said, until we get out of this room and stop just talking about it and start doing it, you know, nothing really works.
Can I say, sorry.
No, I was going to say on Jerry's point here, you know, I'm seeing ban the box initiatives. I'm seeing folks help community members buy developments so that they can actually stay in them, buy them back from the developer and stay in them. I'm seeing places like Austin where they're in their procurement process, they're making sure that folks are providing good wages and doing targeted local hire. You know, I'm seeing all those practical things happen, really good stuff. But my concern is it's not at the scale of the pain in community. And what you also see happening is, in many cases, while that stuff is being done on, I would say, the community development or the foundation side of the house of many corporations, if you look at the lobbying side of the house, it's doing the stuff that I'm telling you about, trying to free capitalism from democracy. So if you think you can unleash your lobbying firms on the state capitol and then clean up the mess on the community development side of the house, that's just not working. And so if we're thinking about the interest of scale, which is the only thing I think that matters right now, we are falling so far behind because we're ceding the conversation about government's role. We're ceding the conversation around institutional leadership. And the work that we're talking about is not going to happen because of philanthropy. Right. It's not going to happen because of individual initiative, while that is important. So I'm just sharing that because if this moment is a scale moment, and I think it is when 1 in 3 Americans are living at 200% of poverty, then I do believe that there is a role for government, and I don't think we should be apologetic about it. I mean, so I think we got to get back to being clear about what are we willing to fight for to achieve the scale of impact that is necessary to improve society.
Ryan, I'm going to let you have the last word, but we are going to go into a question and answer. Oh, and Stephanie has something. Start thinking of your questions, and we do have 2 mics that we'll get to in a couple of minutes. Very quickly, Stephanie. And then
Sure. So I don't disagree about the need for scale, but I also, the work that I do is at an individual leadership development level, and when I was thinking about what is the pragmatic sort of tools that we share, the thing that we train communities in how to do is to create community conversation spaces that are generative, regular, open, inclusive, and that lead to actual projects. I mean, I'm talking about they meet every single week. They're hosted usually in a restaurant or some casual location, very unstructured, and they lead to dozens and over decades, hundreds of community transformation projects. What they also lead to is dozens and hundreds of community leaders. And what we invest in are those individual community leadership relationships and providing coaching to community leaders all over the state. And so I know scale is important, but I also think the individual piece is important, because if you don't have that work in communities, we lose people to these diseases of despair, because they feel like there's no hope and there's no potential in their community, and there's no way for them to get out, and so they check out.
That's right.
Yeah, it's funny. That's related to the point I was going to make, which is, let's be clear. This is a very difficult national moment to be sure. And there should be a fight that's being waged at the national level. Michael and a number of folks are doing that. I worked for a national organization for a very long time, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, doing incredible litigation work at a national level. But the truth is that when change has happened, it's always happened from the ground up in our communities. In Newark 2020, though it's a citywide, even sort of countywide strategy, it was conceived from a conversation I had with my wife, who is a principal of a middle school, a district school in Newark. And she was explaining to me that she was having challenges, particularly in the early grades, first, second, and third grade, teaching her kids the fundamentals because there was such a high rate of transience that she was losing about half of her kids each year between those grades, and more kids would come in. And you can imagine how difficult it is to teach kids the fundamentals. And so she told me that the reason is because there's such employment instability that parents are always moving. So she said, Ryan, if there was some way to connect my parents, who, by the way, are overwhelmingly hungry to work, if there's a way to connect them to work, you could stabilize families, whole communities, and kids could actually stay at their school long enough to learn. And that was really where this citywide strategy came from, a very local moment where folks like my wife and her amazing colleagues and amazing parents and community were thinking about how to strengthen their community through employment, ultimately through education. And so I think a lot about this moment. I mentioned I was at a national organization for a long time, but I've seen the power, to Stephanie's point, of organizing folks locally, because it is not the case that we're powerless in the communities where we live. It's not the case that we have to wait for this difficult national moment to pass. No, I think there's a lot of work to be done to organize around issues we care about in the spaces where we have spheres of influence. There's a lot of work to be done to hold our local and state level elected officials accountable. And this is really what I think we learned through history, particularly as I think a lot about the Voting Rights Act and how that was birthed. This conversation happened between Dr. King and President Johnson. And Dr. King, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, said, what we really need, thanks for that Civil Rights Act, what we really need, President Johnson, is a federal voting rights bill. And you know the story. President Johnson said to Dr. King, the country, this is 1964, the country is suffering from what President Johnson called civil rights fatigue. 1964. And so President Johnson says to Dr. King, if what you want is a federal voting rights bill, then you're going to have to make me do it. And you know the story. They then organize in Selma. The Bloody Sunday March happens. From that comes the birth of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And within one generation, this country elects twice to the highest office in the land, the first African-American president, who then appoints the first black attorney general, Eric Holder, the first black female attorney general, Loretta Lynch. And as you all understand history, you can't possibly imagine this country electing an African-American to the highest office in the land without there being on the other side of that a retrenchment in democracy and then white supremacy in the White House. That is how our history has always been. But I think this is our Selma moment to build democracy and inclusive economy from the ground up in our communities.
We do have some time for questions and answers, and we've got our first person up here.
Hi, good afternoon. David Bowers from Enterprise Community Partners. You all have had some discussion about the notion of building commonality between rural and urban, black, white, and others. And we know from the history of the country that the dehumanization of enslaved Africans, right, has laid a groundwork for pitting poor whites, poor blacks, Dr. King, Poor People's Campaign, Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition, all of that trying to attempt to rectify that. Question I have is, in 2018, in the modern context, what have you all seen, if anything, as arguments that have resonated with poor blacks, Latinos, whites, to help them see the commonalities, right? And amongst whites and blacks of means to see why they should care. Have you seen any effective arguments that might lay the groundwork for not only that individual engagement, but getting to the level of scale that might allow us to unleash political and financial capital that can bring some of the transformation that you all are alluding to?
Well, I'll start with just an emerging conversation. I think it's a really great question, and I think it's one that's troubled me for a long time. And we actually had a conversation like that just earlier today. I think we absolutely have to stop the, what Stephanie called a zero-sum game. We've got to stop the who's suffering more conversation and figure out where our common ground is. But the most compelling argument, and what helped me the most, and actually came from PolicyLink, and we didn't plan this, and I didn't even really realize that they were on the panel, but another friend and colleague, Angela Glover-Blackwell, who is the founder of PolicyLink, wrote a really fabulous piece about the curb cut effect. And if you've ever heard Angela speak and talk about that, she explains how by solving for the least of us, all of us do better. And so I'd highly recommend you just Google Angela Glover-Blackwell and curb cut effect and read that article, and you'll get the whole picture. But on the ground, for what's really happening, the Appalachian Funders Network, which is a group of 80-plus philanthropies and government entities that care about the persistent poverty region of Central Appalachia across 5 states, and PolicyLink have just entered into a conversation about how we begin to create a movement forward of looking at the issue of equity from a racial lens, with the lens of race. So even in my community, which is far more diverse than most of you probably think, but is still predominantly white and seen as predominantly white, again, thank you, J.D. Vance, how can we start a national conversation, a regional conversation, a local, regional, and national conversation where we're saying equity does matter, and we care about it from a race point of view, because if we solve for race, we all win.
Yeah. You know, Stephanie said something, and Ryan joined in this point about local leadership being key in that individualized work, and I think it's so true. And I'm seeing artists all across the country find each other and bring people together through storytelling, telling stories of commonality, and it's really, it's been an effective tool to advance equity. So I'm seeing artist groups do that. There's a lot of social justice funding around arts groups right now that's starting to find its way into local communities, and they're doing that work. I'm also finding a lot of coalitions that are forming, that are being effective in the state houses having to do this. Most recent experience has been with Promised Neighborhoods, watching how this played out in Minnesota, watching the rural communities that did not have Promised Neighborhoods, and Minneapolis and St. Paul did, form a powerful coalition to start getting state dollars actually to fund cradle to career continua throughout the state. And so we're seeing actually when the coalitions come together and that they are formed at the ground level, that powerful things are happening. What you hear me saying, because Stephanie reminded me when I'm short-handed that I'm not communicating clearly, this is a moment to hold that local leadership and the scale opportunity. And what I'm asking people to think about is, if you only want to fund the individual work that is essential, then stop blaming individualized work when it can't achieve the scale to change the indicator. Because we're looking at population level data. So if you're going to look at population level data and say, ain't it awful, then do something about why you were looking at it in the first place that is commensurate with the challenge. And so I'm just sharing that because what's happening all across the country is that it is actual local leaders doing this work, but they're doing it on a shoestring. And they're often not being capitalized to accelerate all the good work that they're doing. So the arts and cultural community is doing it. I'm seeing this happening around cradle to career work. And then if you really want an example of youth across all forms of identities, the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color in California has been going for over 8 years. And they have gotten over 100 bills passed and signed by the governor around restorative justice practices, police transparency, et cetera. So when we say local leaders or national leaders, we mean that because that's where the action is happening. What you hear me really saying is, how do you take all these things that are happening across the country now and have them aggregate up to meet the moment?
Right.
Thank you. I think a gentleman, oh, no? No one moved over here, so we've got one over here then.
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Banks. Thank you so much for what you do to be in that sphere of, community development, working within the communities. I think that's so admirable. I was born in New York, very humble beginnings. I moved to Baltimore about 30 years ago. And I've noticed that in Baltimore, at least, the downtown area has developed exponentially. And those familiar with Baltimore know that Canton and Inner Harbor East and all these other areas have developed over a period of time. And again, those who are familiar with Baltimore, when I first came here, I went down a street called North Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue. That's pretty well the center of the Freddie Gray incident. And it looked terrible. It looked horrible at that time. And over the past 30 years, I've seen all the development, elsewhere in Baltimore City, but I go back to those same areas, and they still look the same. And so I've done a lot. I've served on a lot of boards. I'm a director of the Federal Reserve Bank here in Baltimore. I serve on the Hopkins board and others. And because of my beginning, I felt that it was important for me, my community service, to do something in the community. But I think, and maybe you can help me, that I've become somewhat disenfranchised because the problem seems so vast. If these are systematic systems, they're systematic systems. I guess it's an oxymoron, right? The systems of healthcare, the systems of policing, the systems of housing, the systems of capitalization, and you can go on and on. They are geared to take opportunity away from people. And so I think if change has not come in, and the systems are against change, and the only change that I've seen in my lifetime has been during the Martin Luther King era, when people got together and they just decided and demanded, I think as you said, Michael, demanded change. And that's the only way that I've actually have seen change. But maybe you can speak a little bit about what you're doing or what you feel can be done to reverse or change some of the polarization and the systems that have developed in this country.
You got him thinking, Ken.
Go ahead.
No, I have an idea. So I mentioned I spent a bunch of years as a civil rights litigator. I love litigation. I really like kind of the contentious nature of litigation. But one of the challenges of being a lawyer is you have to find cases that support your argument, right? An authority for your argument. And litigation is by nature very conservative. And so as I was listening to you speak, I think one of the challenges that we often have is we see how significant the challenges are, right? 50 years in the making. Next year is 2019, right? That'll be depending on when you start counting, that's the 400th anniversary of black folks' existence in America. And so if you think about like just the history of exclusion and how it created these systems, these structures that were designed to produce the kind of results we see. So you see the challenges. But then we often, when we think about responding to them, we respond with a response that's not as ambitious. This is really kind of to the point that Michael made. The response is not as ambitious as big as the challenge is. So for example, as I mentioned, New Jersey has one of the greatest wealth disparities in the country. White families, $271,000. Black families, $5,900. And what folks are pushing for in New Jersey is a $15 minimum wage by 2022. Now that's important. Folks need a $15 minimum wage, but $271,000, $5,900, significant racial wealth disparity. $15 minimum wage, right? It's like the response doesn't meet the challenge. And so one of the reasons I enjoy the legal advocacy work we do at the Institute for Social Justice is that we can think about responses that actually meet the challenges. Like our imagination can be commensurate with the challenges we face. So I had a chance to pop my head in another session, and I don't remember her name, but I want to pay attribution. She was talking about the racial wealth gap. Michael and I were talking about this before this panel started. And she said the way you get at the racial wealth gap is that you have to tax the wealthy. And you have to tax the wealthy at a rate that you can redistribute their wealth to build wealth in folks who don't have it. Whoa. But why not? Like, if what you really want is to interrupt systems that have advanced racial inequality in the economic sphere, you have to have a response that is commensurate with the challenge that we face. And so part of what I encourage my staff to do at the Institute, part of what I do is we just imagine, we just think big. Like, if there's anything to learn from Donald Trump, it is that you should swing for the fences. Now, I would argue he's swinging for the fences on the wrong side of history, but he's still swinging for the fences. And too often, the progressive response is $15 minimum wage by 2022, if you don't mind, if it's not too inconvenient, if it doesn't cause too great a burden on you and your profit. You know what I mean? Like, we do a very tepid response to systems that have been advanced over centuries. And part of, I think, the challenge for the progressive movement is to have a response to challenges that meets the size of the challenge, in fact, exceeds the size of the challenge. And in doing that, I think you find, at least I find, myself feeling less content, less overwhelmed by the challenge, because I'm thinking about a way to meet the challenge in a way that's as big as the challenge itself.
What about from Appalachia? Systems change either?
Well, sure. I think that's what we're talking about. I mean, was it every system is designed perfectly for the result that it gets. So if we want to redesign the system, I'm over here, we're in the start where you are on the ground. I think there's a big movement among philanthropy right now to look at systems, entrepreneurs, systems change, how do we invest in systems? And again, that's not the scale, that's not the response, because that's not gonna get where we need to go, and I don't think we let government off the hook. But if we don't change the systems locally and with our local leadership and in our local communities and in our neighborhoods, then nobody gives a damn about me, so I don't vote is always gonna win.
That's right.
So we've got to get there so that we can get to that place where we change the system. This popped into my head, but you know that giving pledge where all the really rich people said, I'm gonna give away all my money in my lifetime? Okay, they're all making more money than they can give away because they can't figure out how to give it away faster than they're making it by just simply having it. You know, so systems, I have this big fantasy that all of those folks sit down and write those multi-million-dollar checks to the hub and to me and to New Jersey's neighborhood, Newark neighborhood, so that, and just say to people, here you go, do the right thing with it. You know, because that's what it's going to take, is that redistribution, and that's only going to happen when nobody cares, so I don't vote doesn't win.
So one specific example I'm thinking about is we spend a pretty good chunk of our time at the hub working on addressing vacant and dilapidated buildings because it's a persistent, systematic challenge in all the communities that we work with. And they always bring it to us as, you know, we need to deal with these vacant buildings. The list of problems that come from vacant buildings is, you know, a mile long. And that's the core of revitalization. You know, we get into those buildings, revitalize our communities. So we do that through policy work and through policy changes, because we found that you can't go community by community and actually address those dilapidated buildings. There are some much bigger challenges at play. For instance, in a number of coalfield communities in West Virginia, between 70 to 80% of all land is owned by out-of-state residents, right? So we don't actually own the land that we live on. So how do you build prosperity if you don't own your own land? You can't own your land, and can't actually do anything on that land because the landowners are holding it because it makes more money for them as unused land than as developed land, right? So that's one thing. The other big thing within this challenge is even starting to have the data to make the case, right? So we did a project with a group called the Center for Community Progress that addresses vacant and dilapidated buildings, often through data and research projects. And they found, they gave us 31 policy solutions that we could implement in West Virginia to address vacant properties, and 40 pieces of data that we were missing that we had to develop before we could move forward those policies. And it's at such a basic level. You know, our counties haven't digitized their data, and then they won't give you access to that data because they don't agree with what you're doing, or they're busy, or whatever. So the level of capacity that's needed to do just the research, I think on this topic, in rural areas, on a lot of topics, and in places where that research hasn't really dug in a local way, becomes such a huge stumbling block for us. But what was interesting to me about the whole issue was we got kind of excited about it because it seemed like it was an issue that bridged polarization. You know, West Virginia State Capitol is just as polarized as any other place, and all the legislators were like, yeah, we care about vacant and dilapidated buildings. That's a non-controversial issue to us. We want to work on it. And so we said, okay, well, we think that the thing that we need to do to start off is to address the tax sale process, because when properties go into the property tax sale, they get taken from people that live in them, and they get basically gone through this process where they make money for a tax speculator. All of a sudden, it was actually a polarizing issue because people were making money off of it. And they said, well, no, this is not an issue that you should be working on. You should be improving code enforcement. You know, you should be giving out tickets to different landowners. You get so quickly shifted into these small pieces of work, what you're talking about here, and looking at that individualized responsibility versus this scale where you can actually make a large impact on the problem. So, but it's hard for us to move into those contentious fights when you don't have the data to say, this is actually the impact, the economic impact of these buildings on our community. This is the lost opportunity, the cost that we're pouring into these buildings every month. So I think we haven't talked about data and research yet, but I just want to make a pitch for it, that is, for us, a constant struggle. We don't have money to do that.
But it's something the Fed can do.
I am aware of where I am right now. And it was,
Let's just put it out there.
yeah, it was really helpful to have those data needs identified, but then it was just a report we had that now sits on our shelf.
And we are past time, I'm sorry. We're going to have to leave it there for our session. I know there's some other questions. I have two things left to do. The first is please join me in thanking our terrific panelists. And the other thing I need to do is a couple of announcements. First of all, to mention that you were given evaluation forms when you got your conference materials. We would love to hear back from you, get that feedback, either in the print version you got, or there is an online version as well, I understand. Please take the time to do that when you have a chance. We're going to go into break, and then afterwards is concurrent sessions. For those of you that are doing the Racial Equity Learning Lab, we have buses downstairs, and as I understand it, you'll take the buses to the lab, and then buses will take you directly to the reception, if I've got that correctly. I'm looking for someone to give me a thumbs up on that.
So the reception is at the location of the lab.
Oh, it's at the location of the lab.
There'll be another bus that you can take.
See, Teresa's, that's the only heartache hopefully I've given her today. So we are adjourned for a break, and then we'll go to these concurrent sessions afterwards. Thank you.